right, welcome to Joy in Our Town. I'm Dave Edwards, your host. We're so glad that you tuned in to be a part of the conversation today. This is a show dedicated to issues and answers of things that are happening all around our city. And you know, I love the title of the show, Joy in Our Town, because joy is deeper and more significant than happiness. So not everything in the city may be happy, but the joy of Jesus can be found in any circumstance, in any place, in any family, if you know how to tap into it. And so today we are dealing with a family issue, and the topic is family forgiveness. And so my guest for the conversation today is Jim Priest, who is the CEO of Sunbeam Services right here in Oklahoma City. So Jim, welcome. Thank you for being here, my friend.
My pleasure.
So glad to be able to talk to you about this, because this is a huge deal. This is, family forgiveness is something that I think never goes away, right? It's always an issue. I've got a friend of mine in Houston that has told me before I got here that she's been holding a grudge against her sister for 35 years, right? This has been going on for her for 35. She's raised kids, got grandkids, and still got an area of unforgiveness. And so I want us to kind of get into this. I know that you're writing an article in the Oklahoman, and so how did all that come about?
Right. Well, the column's called Family Talk, and it usually appears on Monday morning edition in the Oklahoman. And I started writing that because I sensed such a great need for family issues for the truth to be spoken into the community about what God thought about family. And so it's not a column where I always quote Bible verses, but all truth is God's truth.
Right.
And so I speak truth into the marketplace of ideas. And this issue of forgiveness, like you were talking about, it's in every family. I mean, you think about the life of Joseph in the Old Testament and how much there was a need for forgiveness, 360 in that family, and it plagues us still today in a variety of different ways. So I wrote a column recently about an article that appeared in Campus Life magazine some years ago about a young woman named Amber Penny. Amber shared this story in Campus Life, that her father, unbeknownst to her, had an affair while married to Amber's mom. And a baby was born out of that improper relationship. And finally, they broke the truth to Amber, and she really had a difficult time forgiving her dad. Even though she personally, I mean, it wasn't like he had done something directly to her. He'd been unfaithful to Amber's mom. But she had a lot of forgiveness to deal with. And at first she kind of treated it, oh, Daddy, I love you. It's okay, but didn't really get deep enough into the forgiveness and dealing with the anger. And eventually it came out in some emotionally difficult ways. Right.
So you can't hide that stuff forever, right? I mean, a lot of people, you talk about, one of the things that I want to ask you about is that when something like that happens, I mean, although it was her dad who cheated on her mom, she was still affected by it, right? There's always collateral damage.
That's exactly right. And we sometimes forget that. And I think we treat forgiveness too lightly as a general rule. He said, well, tell your brother you're sorry. I'm sorry, okay. And you just kind of move on, but there really isn't any forgiveness there. So if I offended you, I might say, hey, Dave, I'm sorry. And Dave says, well, okay.
Right.
But there's not forgiveness exchanged. I taught my kids, I said, there's a protocol to follow in asking forgiveness. I have to say, Dave, I offended you. I'm sorry. I did you wrong. I lied about you or whatever it was. Would you be willing to forgive me? I have to ask for forgiveness. And then Dave has to say something in response. Maybe it's, yes, Jim, I do forgive you. And then we pray about it. Or maybe Dave says, no, I'm still ticked off about it. I'm not ready to forgive you. And as the person seeking forgiveness, I can't demand forgiveness. I can't say, well, Dave, you're supposed to be a Christian. You should forgive me immediately. Right. Because our emotions are tender. We have to heal. And sometimes Dave might not be ready to immediately forgive me. So one of the things we do at Sunbeam Family Services, we have a counseling program, and it's available on a sliding scale to people of all income levels. And a lot of our counselors deal with people who are dealing with the issue of forgiveness. And so that's a resource that's available. Sometimes we need counseling help to move us through the forgiveness process.
Wow, I mean, I think that's a huge deal. And I know for sure that as a traveling speaker, I run into a lot of families that have just never fully dealt with something. So how do you know when someone, like you talk about, a lot of people go, well, I'll forgive, but I'll never forget.
Right.
Like I hear that a lot.
Right.
But how do you really know, how does someone know when they've really broken through and actually forgiven someone and not just done like what you said, like, well, okay, and blow it off or live in denial or whatever else passes for forgiveness that's really not?
Yeah.
As a counselor, how would you help someone know that they've actually found freedom and broken through that?
Well, I think the individual will know it when it comes, and they should not expect, if you're a person who's hurting and maybe the person who's offended you has never asked for your forgiveness, you still need to forgive that person. You may never forget the hurt, but you can forgive, and it's a process. It's not like a one and done. Okay, well,
Right.
they've apologized and I've forgiven them, so I'm done. There's that, depending on the depth of the problem and how big the hurt was, it may take years for you to go through healing. That's why counseling is so important. One of the things we deal with at Sunbeam is people have a stigma about counseling. Well, only crazy people go to counselors, and I don't want people to think I'm crazy. Or, well, Jesus ought to be able to heal me. I don't need a counselor. I should be able to work through this by praying about it. But God equips us with physicians for our bodies and counselors for our minds, and we need to take advantage of the resources that God makes available to us.
Right. It's not a bad thing, right? Counseling is not a bad thing, especially when you've got someone who's counseling someone using the Word of God as well, right? And being able to combine those two. A lot of people can't just snap out of it on their own, right? And so kind of take everyone through possible steps of, how do you where do you begin when you're going to forgive somebody, and what are those steps of redemption? Yeah.
Well, let's talk about it from the standpoint of the person who's been offended. Clearly, if you have offended somebody, you need to humbly seek their forgiveness and go speak to them about it. We have a lot of problems in our society with confrontation, especially in the Christian community. We think, well, we shouldn't confront one another. But
that's right.
Jesus clearly confronted people. He was overturning tables in the temple.
That's right.
He didn't have a problem with confrontation. So we have to, Leslie and Les Parrott talk about conflict is the doorway to greater intimacy in relationships. And so we have to have conflict sometimes. So if I've offended you or you've offended me, we need to be able to sit down and talk about it. So if I'm the person who's been offended and I'm waiting for Dave to apologize, but he never does apologize, I can't just stuff it down my left leg.
Right.
Because it's going to come out in other ways. It's going to come out in anger or depression. So I need to go to Dave and say, Dave, you may not realize it, but you did this thing and it really hurt me. And I just need to work through this with you. And hopefully Dave would be responsive and you would say to me, well, gosh, Jim, I didn't mean to hurt you. What did I say? And then we begin to talk about it. And then as the person who needs to grant forgiveness and to be healed from the hurt, I need to say, okay, well, Dave, I forgive you, and I'm going to walk through that healing process. It's not going to come immediately. It's not like, okay, the bleeding has stopped and the wound is healed. Wounds take time to heal, and I have to recognize that and pray that God will give me grace day by day to continue to forgive you, because it's like I said, it's not a one and done process.
Right. You do need, I think that's a great point, is that you do need grace every day to look at someone who's offended you, and I think, like what you said, there's an art to being a good forgiver and a good forgivee, right? You have to know how to do it on both sides, really.
Yeah.
And when you're talking, I was thinking about, that our hope really is in Jesus, that with all the wisdom that you have available and you give, ultimately it is in the power of the life of Jesus. I remember I had that image of Jesus hanging on the cross and saying, Father, forgive them.
Right. Well, that's a great example, because he's talking about forgiving someone who's never apologized to Jesus. It wasn't like the people who crucified him said, oh, Jesus, we're really sorry we did this to you. And yet he was extending and requesting forgiveness for them.
He takes the first step.
Yeah. Exactly. He took the initiative.
Wow, and that's a good. I mean, that's a good lesson. Is that there may be some people watching that have to take the first step. You know that that person who's hurt you may not come to you. You may have to go to him and say, "Listen, I'm really working to release this." And I think the other thing that Jesus on the cross, when he takes the initiative, knowing what people are going to do, and he forgives them. But then there's that moment where he says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit."
Right.
That moment of, Lord God, I'm leaving the results up to you.
Right.
I'm leaving what happens and how this plays out. And isn't there a certain position that we have to keep our heart in order to live towards forgiveness?
Right. Well, I think Joseph is the great example of that. I mean, he says to the brothers, after they try to manipulate him into forgiving, "Oh, Dad told us before he died, make sure Joseph forgives you."
Right.
They're still scheming. And he said, don't trouble your hearts. You intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. So there's this superintending providence of God, even in the hurts and the unfairness of life, where he is bringing about that purpose. And Romans 8:28 talks about it too. God's working all things together for good, not that they are good. And so we get hurt and we need forgiveness, we need to extend forgiveness, but he is working all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose.
I think that's a good word. Are there some other verses that you use in regards to forgiveness when you're talking to somebody, as far as giving them a piece of wisdom to hold on to or to apply?
Well, I always think about the grace that God has extended to me. And, Peter impetuously comes to Jesus and says, "Do I have to forgive my brother again?"
Right.
And Jesus, like 7 times, and he thinks he's going the extra mile by going 7. And Jesus says, extend forgiveness 70 times 7. So God doesn't get tired of us coming to his throne to ask for forgiveness. He doesn't say, "Oh, it's priest again. When are you going to straighten up, buddy?"
Right.
He opens his arms of grace and extends forgiveness to us. And so I try to encourage people who struggle with forgiveness, and we run into these folks a lot. They've stuffed it down their left leg. They've not dealt with it. They've not extended forgiveness. They want to hold on to it. It's kind of like the bad tooth. You keep pushing on to see if it still hurts.
Right. That's a great illustration.
It makes no sense.
Right. Keep
you're,
going.
You're hurting yourself as well as withholding forgiveness. So do the 70 times 7. Extend grace as God has extended it to you.
That's a good word. I think this is a good word for this segment, is to keep pushing towards forgiveness and don't quit until you're free. And so Jim Priest is the CEO of Sunbeam Family Services, and your website is sunbeamfamilyservices.org. That's how people can find you. This is Joy in Our Town. I'm Dave Edwards. We'll be right back with more.